"Ma'am, I didn't know you were going to be here tonight." Every glass in that ballroom stopped moving, because a two-star general does not salute a woman in a modest black dress standing quietly by the drink table, except he just did, and he said a name, Black Viper, that only a handful of people on this earth were ever supposed to know. Her sister's champagne froze halfway to her lips. Her father's face went the color of the tablecloths. 15 years of also in the army, of not built for the sharp end, of a whole family's quiet certainty about which daughter mattered more. All of it cracked open in 4 seconds, in front of 40 strangers holding drinks they'd forgotten they were holding. Because the quiet one wasn't quiet by accident. She was Black Viper, and her family was about to find out exactly what that name had been protecting them from ever having to understand. The ballroom smelled like rented flowers and cheap champagne, and Harlow Sinclair was already counting the exits. Old habit. The kind that never left, no matter how many folding chairs and gold balloon arches tried to convince her this was just a party. 2 doors at the back, 1 fire exit past the bar, propped with a rubber wedge, because some staff member hadn't wanted to deal with the alarm. A window on the east wall, low enough to climb through if it ever came to that. It never came to that. Not at a promotion party for her little sister. But she counted anyway, because counting was cheaper than feeling, and feeling was expensive tonight. Her father's voice found her before she found a place to hide. That girl, Walter Sinclair was saying, loud enough to carry over the string quartet nobody had asked for, has ice water in her veins, I'm telling you. Ice water. He had his hand on some captain's shoulder, some man Harlow didn't recognize, someone young enough to still think a retired Navy commander's approval mattered. You know what she told them? During the final eval. Somebody mentioned the name they use to scare recruits straight, Black Viper, and my daughter looks him dead in the eye and says, Black Viper never scared me. Laughter. The good kind. The kind that comes easy when champagne is doing half the work. Harlow didn't laugh. She picked up her water glass instead, held it like a shield, because that was easier than explaining what her chest was doing right now, which was something between a flinch and a held breath, and she didn't have a word for that yet. Wouldn't for another 4 minutes. 4 minutes. That was all the room had left before everything in it changed. She didn't know that yet either. What she knew was this. Her father was retelling a story that wasn't his, about a moment he hadn't witnessed, using a name he didn't understand, to a room full of strangers who would clap for it regardless. And her sister Paisley, 26 years old, freshly pinned captain, top of her advanced scout sniper class, glowing under a banner that said congratulations in gold cursive, stood at the center of that story, like she'd been born standing there. Because in a way she had. Paisley had never once in her life had to fight for a room's attention. Rooms simply gave it to her, the way water gives itself to the lowest point. Harlow found a spot near the drink table, far enough back to watch, close enough to leave if she needed to. She needed to. She wouldn't. Not yet. Because across the room, near the doorway, a man in dress blues had just gone very still. Harlow didn't see him yet. Wouldn't, for another several minutes. But he had seen her, recognized the line of her shoulders even from behind, recognized the way she stood at the edge of a crowded room instead of inside it, watching angles instead of people. He set down his drink slowly, deliberately, like a man putting down a weapon before he did something that couldn't be taken back. He started walking. And that was the moment everything. Harlow Sinclair had spent 15 years building around herself, the quiet, the invisibility, the careful architecture of a woman who had stopped expecting to be seen, started to come apart in a room full of people who had no idea what they were about to watch. But to understand what happened in the 4 minutes after that, you have to go back. Further than the party, further than the promotion, further than the course, further than the name Black Viper itself. You have to go back to the beginning. Because nothing that happened in that ballroom happened by accident. It had been building for 29 years, one quiet dinner table at a time. Harlow Grace Sinclair was born on a base in Norfolk, Virginia, in a hospital that smelled like antiseptic and diesel, to a father who had wanted a son and gotten a daughter, and decided, somewhere in that first week, that it didn't matter. Not really. Not if he raised her right. Walter Sinclair had been a Navy man for 11 years. Before a training accident took the hearing in his left ear and most of the mobility in his right shoulder, and ended a career he'd built his whole identity around. He didn't talk about it much. He didn't have to. You could see it on him the way you see a scar on someone who's stopped bothering to cover it. A kind of permanent, unfinished sentence. He'd been a commander when it happened. Not a bad rank to leave on. Respectable. Solid. The kind of rank you could put on a business card for the rest of your life and have people nod like it meant something, which it did. Except it also meant something had stopped. A door that used to be open closed early before he'd finished walking through it. Harlow grew up watching her father look at the flag on the porch like it owed him an explanation. She was an only child for 7 years. Long enough to learn the rhythms of a house where love came quiet and steady, where her father took her fishing and taught her to read a compass and told her more than once that she had good instincts, calm hands, a mind that noticed things other people missed. She believed him. She had no reason not to. Then Paisley arrived, and the whole house recalibrated around a new center of gravity. It wasn't Paisley's fault. Harlow understood that even as a child, in the dim animal way children understand unfairness before they have language for it. Paisley was loud because the house rewarded loud. Paisley performed because performance got a reaction, and reactions were currency, and some children learn early that currency is the only thing keeping the lights on inside them. Diane Sinclair worked long shifts at the hospital. Walter worked contracts that kept him gone 3 weeks out of 4. And in the gaps in the exhausted, stretched thin gaps of a working military family, attention became a resource. Scarce. Contested. Paisley learned to compete for it before she could spell her own name. Harlow learned something else. She learned that if she didn't need anything, nobody had to give her anything, and there was a strange, hollow peace in that. She did her homework without being asked, brought home report cards, and left them on the counter instead of announcing them. Her mother started calling her low maintenance, and it took Harlow until she was almost 30 to understand that low maintenance was not a compliment. It was a diagnosis. It meant nobody has to spend energy noticing you. It meant we have decided you can survive on less. She survived on less. She got very good at it. By the time Harlow enlisted in the Marine Corps at 22, straight out of a college degree in criminal justice, that her father had quietly hoped would lead to law school, the family had already sorted itself into a shape that felt permanent. Paisley was the one going somewhere. Harlow was the one who was fine. Nobody said it in those exact words. Nobody had to. It lived in the way conversations moved, the way attention flowed, the way her father's face lit up differently depending on which daughter was talking. When Harlow told him she was enlisting, he cried. Actual tears. Standing in the kitchen, gripping her shoulder with the hand on his good side. For a while, for almost 2 years, she was the one finishing what he'd started. He told his golf buddies about it. He told the mailman about it. He told anyone who would stand still long enough. Then her career took a turn he couldn't follow, and the pride curdled into something quieter and more confused, and it never fully came back. It wasn't dramatic. That was the thing nobody understood about how these lives actually worked. The ones lived in the gap between what a person did and what they were allowed to say about it. There was no single conversation where the door closed. It was 100 small ones. Her father asking what she'd been doing the last few months, and Harlow saying training cycle, evaluation rotation, can't really get into it, and watching something in his face fall a half inch every time. He wanted a war story. He got a shrug wrapped in careful, practiced vagueness. And a man who had spent his whole life defining himself by what he'd done in uniform did not know what to do with a daughter who had apparently done something significant and would not tell him what. Paisley never had that problem. Paisley told everyone everything, every score, every qualification, every instructor's offhand compliment blown up into an origin myth by the time it reached the dinner table. And because Harlow stayed quiet and Paisley stayed loud, the family arrived at a conclusion nobody ever said out loud, but everyone quietly believed. Paisley was going somewhere. Harlow was standing still. She let them believe it. Partly pride, partly the simple, bone-deep exhaustion of trying to explain a classified world to people who wanted campfire stories. And partly, if she was honest, which she rarely let herself be about this particular thing, because some tired, folded-up part of her had stopped believing it would change anything even if she tried. So she stopped trying. The silence filled in with someone else's version of events, and over the years that version started writing Harlow into it as a supporting character in Paisley's story. Not cruelly. Never cruelly, not exactly. Just casually. The way people say things about family members they've stopped really looking at. Not everybody's built for the pointy end, Lil. Paisley had said once, at a 4th of July cookout, in front of half the cul-de-sac, because Paisley had a gift for making cruelty sound like affection. You were always more of a desk person anyway, she'd said another time. At a Christmas dinner Harlow had driven 6 hours through an ice storm to attend. Harlow let those land, or told herself she did. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from being underestimated by the people who are supposed to know you best. And somewhere along the way, she had simply stopped correcting the record. It felt easier. It felt like the path of least damage to the room, to her father's fragile pride in having 2 daughters, who both wore the uniform, to whatever fragile piece the family had cobbled together out of not asking too many questions. What none of them knew, what she had never told them, because by then she genuinely believed they wouldn't understand it, even if she laid it out in detail, was that at 24, Harlow had been selected for a program most Marines never heard of, and fewer still qualified for: advanced reconnaissance. Precision marksmanship at a level that stopped being about hitting targets and became something closer to a discipline, a philosophy, a way of waiting that most people were constitutionally incapable of sustaining. She had trained under men who did not raise their voices, in schoolhouses that did not appear on public rosters, alongside a handful of other Marines who understood, the way she did, that the actual skill was never the trigger pull. It was everything before it. The stillness, the patience, the ability to observe a situation for hours without needing to be the one who acted on it first. It was not glamorous. It was not the movie version. There was no slow motion, no swelling music. There were hundreds of hours of lying in wet grass, learning to control her own heartbeat. There were evaluators who tested her, not on how well she could shoot, but on how long she could wait before she needed to. That was where the name came from. Black Viper. Not for kill counts. Not for anything cinematic. An instructor had said it first, half joking, during a field exercise where Harlow had gone 17 hours without moving from a position 3 other candidates had abandoned. You never know Black Vipers in the room, he'd said, until it's too late to matter. It stuck the way nicknames stick in small closed worlds, quickly, permanently, without anyone deciding it on purpose. The name outlived her time as an active shooter. When Harlow transitioned into instruction, into building the evaluation frameworks that would go on to test the next generation of scout snipers coming up through the pipeline, some of those frameworks kept her fingerprints on them long after she'd stopped being the one lying in the grass. In certain small, closed rooms scattered across the Corps, Black Viper had become something like a unit of measurement. A standard people were held against, without most of them ever knowing whose standard it actually was. At home, none of that existed. At home, she was still just Harlow, also in the Marines. 2 words her mother used more times than Harlow could count, always in that same offhand tone, the tone that filed her somewhere just below Paisley on a hierarchy. Nobody admitted was there, but everyone silently obeyed. Which brought them, 5 years and a whole unspoken career later, to a rented ballroom off base in Jacksonville, North Carolina, with a banner that said "Congratulations, Captain Sinclair" in gold cursive letters, and a string quartet nobody had asked for, and a version of Harlow Sinclair, standing near the drink table with a water glass in her hand, counting exits out of habit, 4 minutes away from the moment her whole family would discover they'd misunderstood her for the better part of 15 years. She had almost not come. That was the part she'd never admit to anyone. Not to her sister, not to her father, who had called twice to confirm she'd be there, his voice carrying that particular anxious cheer he got whenever he was managing a family event instead of simply attending one. Not even, really, to herself, except in the honest, unguarded 3 seconds right before she'd pulled into the parking lot and sat there with the engine off, hands on the wheel, telling herself this was 1 hour, 1 glass of wine, a handshake circuit, and an early exit, the way it always went, the way it had gone for every family gathering, for as long as she could remember. She had a flight the next morning. That was true and also useful, because it gave her a clean exit line for whenever the room got to be too much. Early flight. Have to be up at 4. Nobody in her family ever asked where the flight was going. They'd stopped asking those questions years ago. The way you stop touching a bruise once you've learned exactly how much it hurts. The venue sat just off the main road. A squat brick building that had probably hosted 100 wedding receptions and Christmas parties and retirement send-offs before tonight, indistinguishable from any of them, except for the banner and the particular flavor of tension that came from a military family trying to look effortless in public. Harlow parked at the far end of the lot. Old habit again. Always leave yourself a clean line to the exit. Inside, the room was already half full. White folding chairs arranged around round tables with pale blue tablecloths. A gift table sagging slightly under wrapped boxes, and a card box shaped like a treasure chest, which felt like the kind of detail Paisley would have picked out herself, something a little theatrical, a little more than the occasion strictly required. String quartet in the corner, actual musicians, actual instruments, which meant somebody had spent real money on this, playing something classical and forgettable that nobody in the room was actually listening to. And in the middle of it all, holding court the way she'd held court at every gathering since she was old enough to walk into a room and expect it to turn toward her, was Paisley. She looked good. Harlow would give her that freely, without any of the resentment people probably assumed lived underneath every compliment she gave her sister. Paisley had always looked good, the kind of effortless good that made other women's shoulders drop half an inch in comparison. And tonight, in her dress blues with the new captain's bars catching the overhead light, she looked like exactly what the banner said she was. A woman who had earned a room's full attention and knew precisely what to do with it. Harlow made her way toward the edges, not to hide, just to orient herself, the way she did in any new space, cataloging without meaning to. Exits. Crowd density. The location of her parents. She found her father first, near the center of a small cluster of guests, his hand on some young officer's shoulder. Already 3 drinks into a story Harlow could tell from 20 feet away was about Paisley. Ice water in her veins, he was saying, loud enough to carry. I'm telling you. Harlow didn't need to hear the rest. She'd heard some version of this story before, in other rooms, at other gatherings, the details shifting slightly each time, the way stories do when they're told for effect instead of accuracy. Her mother found her before she found her mother, which was usually how it went. There you are. Diane Sinclair appeared at her elbow with a glass of white wine, and the particular brightness she reserved for public spaces, a brightness that felt less like warmth and more like a performance of warmth, rehearsed enough to pass. You made it, said I would. I know. Diane's eyes were already drifting past her, scanning the room, the way they always did, like she was perpetually checking whether something more interesting had started happening somewhere else. You look tired, honey. I'm fine. You always say that, because it's usually true. Diane didn't answer that. She'd already spotted someone across the room, a woman in a green dress Harlow didn't recognize, and her hand came up in a small, excited wave. Oh, Carol. Carol, come here. I want you to meet the girls. The word girls did a lot of work in that sentence, Harlow thought. Plural, interchangeable. A category rather than 2 distinct people, with 2 distinct careers standing 11 feet apart in the same room. Carol arrived in a cloud of perfume and enthusiasm, already talking before she'd fully closed the distance. Oh my goodness, is this her? Is this the captain? That's Paisley over there. Diane pointed unnecessarily, since Paisley was impossible to miss. This is my other daughter, Harlow. She's in the Marines too. Also in the Marines too. Harlow had heard some version of that sentence at every family gathering for the last 5 years, and it landed the same way every time, a small, precise incision, quick enough that it barely registered as pain until later, when she was alone and had time to notice the shape of what had been cut away. She'd stopped correcting it. There was a particular kind of exhaustion that came from explaining yourself to people who'd already decided who you were, and Harlow had made peace with that exhaustion a long time before tonight. "Oh, how nice," Carol said, already turning back toward Paisley. "Already done. You two must be so close." "We are," Harlow said, because it was easier than the truth, and because the truth didn't fit in the 4 seconds Carol was willing to spend on this conversation before her attention migrated elsewhere. She excused herself toward the drink table not long after that, not because she was thirsty, because it gave her somewhere to stand that didn't require conversation, and because standing near an exit with a glass in her hand was a socially acceptable way to disappear in plain sight. This was the part of these evenings nobody warned you about. Not the big cruelties. There were rarely big cruelties. Not really. Nothing dramatic enough to point to and say, "Here, this is where it happened." It was the accumulation, the small, repeated erosions. A hand on a shoulder that never quite landed on hers. A story told to a stranger that used the word girls instead of a name. An entire evening organized, without anyone deciding it on purpose, around the gravitational pull of one daughter, while the other orbited somewhere at the edges, present but not quite seen. Her phone buzzed in her clutch. She almost didn't check it, old instinct. Don't be the woman staring at her phone at her sister's party, but something made her glance down anyway. A text from an unknown number. Just a string of digits and a short line, confirmed for 600 Monday. Bring the file. She read it twice, deleted it. Old habit. That too, nothing that could be traced back, sat in her phone for longer than it needed to. She tucked the clutch back under her arm and felt the small, familiar weight of the ID card inside it, the one she carried out of habit more than necessity these days, worn soft at the corners from 5 years of handling. Nobody in this room knew what that card actually said. Nobody in this room had ever asked to see it. She told herself that didn't matter. She'd told herself that for a long time now, and mostly, on most nights, she almost believed it. Tonight was not. It would turn out one of those nights. The crowd near the center of the room had thickened, drawn in by whatever Paisley was saying, her hands moving in wide, animated gestures, her voice pitched to carry. Harlow drifted closer without quite meaning to. The way you drift toward a fire in a cold room even when you know better than to get too close. "And the instructor just looks at me," Paisley was saying, mid-story, champagne glass tilting dangerously in one hand, and he says, "Sinclair, you do that again, you're gonna fail this whole phase." And I looked right back at him and I said, "Sir, respectfully, I already know I'm right." Laughter. A ripple of it moving through the small crowd like wind through grass. "Were you?" someone asked. "Right, I mean. Obviously." Paisley grinned, delighted with herself, delighted with the room, delighted with the entire shape of the evening. "I finished top of the class. You don't get there being wrong." More laughter. Harlow watched from 6 feet back, holding her water glass, saying nothing, feeling the particular strange ache of watching someone she loved perform a version of confidence that was, underneath it, mostly armor. She knew that armor. She'd worn a version of it herself, once, a long time ago, before 5 years of actual field work had taught her the difference between confidence and the fear of ever admitting doubt out loud. Somebody told me they still teach a course built around some legend. A man near the back of the group said young, a first lieutenant by his collar insignia, clearly trying to impress someone in the circle. Black Viper. That true? The name landed in the room like a dropped glass. Except nobody heard it break except Harlow. Her spine straightened. Just slightly. Just enough that if anyone had been watching her instead of Paisley, they might have noticed. Nobody was watching her. Why would they? Nobody in this room, except possibly one man standing quietly near the back doors in dress blues, had any reason to connect that name to a woman holding a water glass at the edge of the crowd. Paisley's face lit up. This was exactly the kind of question she loved, a chance to be the expert, The insider, the one who knew things other people only whispered about. Oh, Black Viper. She tossed her hair back, the gesture she made when she wanted an audience, and knew she had one. Yeah, they mention that name like it's supposed to make you sweat. Is it true they never found the guy? Like nobody knows who it actually is? Please. Paisley took a sip of champagne, drawing the moment out, savoring it. Even Black Viper never scared me. The group laughed, the easy champagne loosened. Laugh of people at a party who wanted to be entertained by the woman of the hour, and would have laughed at almost anything she said in that moment, given the mood in the room and the volume of alcohol already circulating. It was not a cruel laugh. It was not aimed at anyone. That was in its own way the worst part. Harlow didn't laugh. She picked up her water glass and took a slow sip, mostly to give her hands something to do, because Black Viper wasn't a legend to her. It was hers. A call sign given to her almost 5 years ago, back when she was young enough to still believe the uniform was going to define who she was. Instead of becoming one long, quiet chapter in a much longer story, nobody at this party had any idea she was living. Paisley glanced her way as she said it. Not accidentally. There was a particular look Paisley got when she was scoring a point too small for anyone else in the room to register a flicker at the corner of her mouth, like she was checking a box only she could see. She wanted Harlow to hear it. She always wanted Harlow to hear it. Even now, even at 26 years old with new captain's bars on her collar and an entire room's admiration in the palm of her hand. Some competitions never fully end. They just find quieter arenas to keep being fought in. Harlow said nothing. She never said anything in these moments. It was easier that way. Easier for the family, easier for the party, easier for the fragile version of peace they had all agreed, without ever discussing it out loud, to maintain since she was old enough to understand that being right wasn't worth being the reason a family dinner went quiet. Peace, she was about to learn, had a shelf life, and hers had just run out, because behind Paisley, near the back doors, a man in dress blues had gone very still. Harlow recognized him the moment she let herself actually look Major General Colm Ashford, a name she hadn't expected to hear or see in this room, in this state, on this particular Tuesday night in a rented hall off a 2-lane road in Jacksonville, North Carolina. She'd crossed paths with him years ago, during a training cycle most people in this room had never heard of and wouldn't have believed if she'd tried to describe it. He'd been a colonel then. He wasn't smiling now. He was looking past Paisley, directly at Harlow, with the particular expression men wear when they see a ghost they'd stopped expecting to run into. She felt the room tilt slightly, not physically. Something quieter than that. The specific vertigo of two worlds she'd spent 5 years keeping carefully apart, suddenly occupying the same folding chair and string quartet square footage. Because there was one more thing about Ashford that made this worse, that turned a coincidence into something closer to a controlled detonation. And it was this she knew, the way you knowing a fact you filed away and mostly forgotten, that Ashford had served with her father, years ago. Before Harlow was old enough to remember any of it clearly. Walter Sinclair's name would mean something to that man, and Ashford's presence here tonight was not. She understood in the half-second it took her stomach to drop, a coincidence at all. Someone had invited him. Someone in this family had invited the one man in the world capable of connecting the two halves of Harlow Sinclair's life without her permission, and had done it without knowing what they were setting in motion. Paisley turned to see what had caught the general's attention. Her champagne glass still raised, her smile still fixed in place from her own punchline, a half-second earlier. She said, straightening automatically, the way you did around senior officers, no matter how many drinks you'd had. I didn't realize you were coming. Ashford didn't answer her. He stepped past her instead, slowly, deliberately. His eyes locked on Harlow's, and for a moment the noise of the party, the quartet, the laughter, the low hum of 100 private conversations seemed to fall away entirely, the way sound does right before something important happens. He stopped a few feet from her, and in the space of a breath, in front of her entire family and 40 strangers holding champagne glasses, Major General Colm Ashford came to attention and rendered a formal salute. Ma'am. His voice carried, not loud, but clear enough to cut through the whole room, the way a single true note cuts through noise. "I didn't know you were going to be here tonight." Harlow felt every eye in the ballroom shift toward her at once. She saw her sister's champagne glass stop, halfway to her lips, suspended in the exact position it had been a half-second earlier, as if time itself had decided to pause and give everyone a moment to catch up. She saw her mother's smile freeze, the practiced brightness cracking at the edges like a photograph left too long in the sun. She saw her father, Walter Sinclair, retired Navy commander, a man who had spent his career learning exactly what a salute like that meant and exactly how rarely it was given, without cause, go very, very still. For the first time in almost as long as Harlow could remember, her family was about to discover that the quiet daughter they had spent a lifetime overlooking had a shadow they knew absolutely nothing about. "General," Harlow's own voice came out steady, trained steady, the kind of steady that took years to build and seconds to test. She set down her water glass, slow and deliberate, and returned the salute out of pure muscle memory, aware even as she did it how strange it looked, how impossible to explain. A woman in a modest black dress snapping into a formal salute in the middle of a promotion party. "Wasn't sure I'd make it either, sir." Ashford's hand came down. His expression didn't soften exactly, but something in it shifted, the wariness of a man who has just walked into a situation he did not expect and is recalculating in real time. Didn't mean to make a scene. He glanced briefly at the frozen tableau around them. Paisley's suspended glass, Diane's cracking smile, Walter's stillness. Force of habit. "No," Harlow said quietly. "I understand." Somewhere behind her, Paisley found her voice, though it came out thinner than the confident tone she'd been using all evening. "Sir." A short, uncertain laugh. The kind people make when they're hoping a joke will retroactively explain something that clearly isn't a joke. "You mean her?" She gestured toward Harlow, a small, almost apologetic wave, like she was pointing out a mistake in front of a teacher. "This is my sister, Harlow." Ashford's gaze didn't move. "I know exactly who I mean, Captain." The words landed with a weight that had nothing to do with volume. Harlow watched something ripple through the small cluster of younger officers who'd gathered around her sister. Minutes earlier, a couple of them exchanging glances, quick and involuntary. The particular look of people who had heard a name, spoken with reverence in classrooms and briefing rooms, and were now trying, visibly, to reconcile the myth they'd built in their heads, with the woman standing quietly by the drink table in a modest black dress, holding a glass of water she'd just set down. "What did he just call you?" Paisley's voice had dropped, the performance stripped away, something rawer underneath it. "Harlow." "What did he—" "You heard him," Harlow said. She kept her voice level. Not cold, just even, the way she'd trained herself to be even in every room that mattered, for longer than her sister had been old enough to notice. For a moment, nobody in that ballroom moved. Then Walter Sinclair took a step forward, and something in his face had changed entirely. The pride, the easy champagne warmth, all of it drained out and replaced by something closer to confusion. The particular bewilderment of a man watching a familiar photograph rearrange itself into an image he didn't recognize. "Combe." His voice cracked slightly on the name, the informality of it strange, after the formal "sir" hanging in the air a moment earlier. "What?" He stopped, started again. "What's going on here?" Ashford turned toward him, and for the first time that evening his expression softened, just slightly, the look of a man greeting an old friend even in the middle of something neither of them had planned for. "Walter." A beat. "It's good to see you." His eyes moved back to Harlow, and something in the way he said the next sentence made it clear. He understood exactly what he was about to detonate, and had decided, for reasons of his own, that it needed detonating. "I don't think you ever told me your daughter served under Colonel Reyes's program." Walter blinked. "Which daughter?" Ashford didn't answer immediately. He looked at Harlow instead, a silent question, an old habit of asking permission before he said something that couldn't be unsaid. Harlow held his gaze for a long moment. 5 years of careful, deliberate silence sat behind her eyes in that moment, and she understood, with the particular clarity that comes right before something irreversible, that whatever happened next was no longer entirely in her control. It hadn't been in her control since the moment someone she still didn't know who would spend the rest of the night turning that question over had put Colm Ashford's name on a guest list next to her father's. She gave the smallest nod. It was enough. This one, Ashford said, and the word carried more weight than any explanation could have. He was looking directly at Harlow now, and his voice, when it came again, had the particular gravity of a man choosing every word with the care of someone who understood exactly how much they would cost. It's an honor to see you again, Black Viper. The name landed in the ballroom like a dropped glass, except this time, everyone heard it break. Harlow watched it move through the crowd in slow, rippling waves. She watched her mother's hand rise to her own throat, an unconscious, protective gesture, the kind you make when the floor has shifted under you and your body hasn't caught up to your mind yet. She watched her father's mouth open slightly, no sound coming out, his eyes moving between Ashford and Harlow, like a man trying to solve an equation with numbers he'd never been given. And she watched her sister. Paisley had gone the color of the tablecloths. Her champagne glass, still tilted at that suspended angle from a full minute earlier, finally finished its arc downward, and she set it on the nearest table with a hand that wasn't quite steady, the sound of glass against linen, unnaturally loud, in a room that had gone almost silent. That's not Paisley's voice came out smaller than Harlow had heard it in years. That's not possible. Why not? Ashford's tone wasn't unkind. It was, if anything, curious, the tone of a man genuinely puzzled by the objection. Because Paisley stopped. Started again. Because they talk about Black Viper like another stop. Harlow watched her sister search for the end of that sentence and failed to find one that made sense out loud, in front of 40 guests and their entire family, and a 2-star general who had just, with 11 words, rearranged the architecture of everything. Paisley thought she understood about her older sister. Like what, Captain? Ashford asked, and there was something almost gentle underneath the rank he used. A small kindness folded into a question that was, underneath it, not gentle at all. Paisley didn't answer, because there was no answer that didn't require admitting, in front of everyone, that she had spent the better part of an hour that evening mocking a name she had no idea belonged to the sister standing 11 feet away from her, holding a water glass, saying nothing, letting the silence do what silence always did in this family, filling in with whatever version of the truth was easiest for everyone else to carry. Walter found his voice before Paisley did. Harlow. He said her name like he was testing whether it still fit the person standing in front of him. Is gestured, helpless at Ashford, at the room, at all of it. Is this true? Harlow looked at her father, and for a moment, just a moment, brief enough that she'd wonder later whether she'd imagined it, she felt something close to sympathy for him. He had spent his whole life defining pride by what could be spoken aloud at a dinner table, by ribbons and rank and stories with clean beginnings and satisfying endings. She had never given him any of that. Not because she didn't have it, because the version of her life that would have satisfied him didn't exist in a form she was allowed to hand over. It's true, she said quietly. Most of it, anyway. Most of it. Walter repeated the words like they belonged to a foreign language. What does that mean, most of it? 15 years, Harlow. 15 years, and I'm hearing this from... He gestured again, this time toward Ashford, unable to finish the sentence, the sheer scale of what he didn't know suddenly too large to fit into a single accusation, all right? You're hearing it now, Harlow said, because somebody invited a man to this party who happened to recognize me. That's the only reason. I wasn't planning on this happening. Tonight. I wasn't planning on this happening at all. Then when? Her father's voice cracked again, and this time it wasn't confusion underneath it. It was something closer to hurt, old and sudden all at once, the particular grief of realizing a door had been closed for years without ever noticing you were the one who'd shut it. When were you planning on telling us? Harlow felt the old, familiar exhaustion rise up in her chest, the specific tiredness that came from being asked to account for a silence she hadn't built alone. When would you have listened? She asked, and her voice, when it came out, wasn't sharp, it was tired. Genuinely, bone-deep tired. The tiredness of a woman who had rehearsed this exact conversation in her head 100 times over 5 years and had never once expected to actually have it, let alone in front of a string quartet and a gift table shaped like a treasure chest. Walter opened his mouth, closed it again. He was searching. She could see it plainly on his face, running back through years of holidays and phone calls and Sunday dinners, looking for the moment he would have made room for an answer he had apparently decided, somewhere along the way, that he didn't need to ask for. He didn't find one. Ashford, watching the exchange with the careful stillness of a man who understood, he'd just walked into the middle of something far older than tonight, cleared his throat gently. "I think," he said, "there may be more to discuss here than I intended to start." "You started plenty," Paisley said, and there was an edge in her voice now, something defensive and sharp cutting through the shock. She turned to Harlow, and her eyes had a wet, glassy quality that hadn't been there a few minutes earlier. "So what, you've just been letting me talk about some legend all night, knowing the whole time it was you? You couldn't have said something, anything? Would it have mattered?" Harlow asked. "You'd already decided what I was, Paisley. You decided it a long time ago. That's not fair, isn't it?" Harlow felt the calm in her voice finally start to fray, just slightly at the edges. "You've spent 5 years telling people I'm the desk person, the not built for the sharp end sister. You said it again tonight, not 20 minutes ago, in front of everyone in this room. Even Black Viper never scared me. Except you weren't talking about a legend, Paisley. You were talking about me. You just didn't know it." The color that had drained from Paisley's face at the salute rushed back all at once, hot and furious, though Harlow couldn't tell whether it was anger or shame driving it, and suspected, watching her sister's jaw work silently for a moment, that Paisley didn't fully know either. "I didn't," Paisley started, and stopped, and tried again. "How was I supposed to know? You never told me anything. You never tell anyone anything. You just stand there, all quiet and mysterious, like the rest of us are supposed to guess. I'm not required to perform my career for this family to believe it exists. Nobody's asking you to perform. We're asking you to talk. You're asking me to talk," Harlow said, "the way you ask someone to move out of your light." The room had gone very quiet around them. Harlow was aware, distantly, of the sensation of being watched by 40 people who had come here for cake and champagne, and were instead witnessing something they would talk about for months, the way people always talked about the moment a family's careful architecture came apart in public. She was aware of the string quartet, who had stopped playing at some point without her noticing, the musicians sitting frozen with their instruments half raised, unsure whether the evening called for music or silence. She was aware, most of all, of her mother. Diane Sinclair had not said a single word since the salute. She stood a few feet from Walter, one hand still at her throat, her face doing something complicated that Harlow couldn't fully read, not quite shock, not quite guilt, something in between, the expression of a woman doing rapid, painful arithmetic and arriving, over and over, at an answer she didn't want. "Mom," Harlow said quietly, and Diane's eyes snapped to her like she'd been startled out of a private room in her own head. "You want to say something?" Diane opened her mouth. For a moment, Harlow thought she might actually say it, whatever it was, the thing sitting behind her eyes, the thing that had her hand pressed flat against her collarbone like she was holding something in. But Diane Sinclair had spent 30 years perfecting the art of not saying things, and old skills Harlow was learning in real time did not disappear just because the room demanded otherwise. "I think," Diane said finally, her voice thin, "we should sit down. All of us. Somewhere quieter." "That's not an answer, Mom." Harlow. A warning faint but unmistakable, the same tone her mother had used 100 times over the years, whenever a conversation threatened to go somewhere uncomfortable in public. "Not here. You keep saying that." Harlow heard her own voice rising, just slightly, the careful control she'd maintained for the last several minutes starting to fracture at the edges. "Not here. Not now. Not in front of people. There's never a good time, is there? There's never been a good time in 15 years for anyone in this family to actually ask me a real question and wait for the real answer." "That's not fair," Walter said, echoing his younger daughter's exact words from moments earlier, and something about the repetition, the way both of them had reached for the same defense, almost word for word, landed harder than either of them probably intended. Fair. Harlow let out a short breath that wasn't quite a laugh. You want to talk about fair? Fine. Let's talk about fair. She felt something shift inside her chest. Some old lock finally giving way after years of careful maintenance. And she understood distantly that whatever came out of her mouth next was not going to be careful. She had spent 15 years being careful. She had spent this entire evening, right up until Ashford's salute, being careful. The careful had run out somewhere in the last 2 minutes, burned away by the specific, precise heat of watching her family search for someone to blame for a silence they had all, in their own ways, helped construct. Sir, she said, turning to Ashford, I'd like to ask you not to say anything else. Not tonight. Ashford studied her for a long moment. There was something almost apologetic in his expression now, the look of a man who had genuinely not intended to walk into the middle of a family reckoning, and now found himself standing at the exact center of one. I owe you that much, he said. I do think, though. He hesitated, glancing briefly at Paisley, who was watching him with an expression caught somewhere between dread and pleading. I think there's something your family should eventually know. Not tonight, but eventually. What do you mean? Paisley's voice had gone tight, almost brittle. What else is there to know? Ashford didn't answer right away. He looked at Harlow instead. Another silent question. Another old habit of asking permission before saying something that couldn't be unsaid. Harlow felt her stomach drop before she'd even fully processed what he might mean. There was only one thing it could be. Only one connection between herself and Paisley's course that Ashford could possibly be dancing around, and she felt the pieces arranging themselves in her mind with a sick, sliding inevitability even before he spoke. General, she said quietly. Don't. I think they should hear it from you, Ashford said. Not tonight if you'd rather not, but soon. He turned to Paisley, and his voice, when he continued, carried the particular weight of a man choosing to be kind by being honest. Captain, do you remember the compromised approach scenario? The one that gave you the most trouble during your final field evaluation? Paisley went very still. Yes, sir. Do you know who developed that scenario? The color that had rushed back into Paisley's face a few minutes earlier drained out of it again, faster this time, leaving her almost gray under the ballroom's overhead lights. No, she said, and her voice had dropped to something barely above a whisper. I don't. Ashford glanced at Harlow one more time, a final question. A final offer of restraint if she wanted it, and Harlow, standing at the center of a ballroom full of frozen guests and a family she no longer fully recognized, understood that there was no version of tonight that ended without this particular truth finding its way into the open air. She could stop it here. She could ask him to wait, to let this land in private, to give Paisley the dignity of hearing it away from 40 strangers with champagne glasses in their hands. Some quiet, exhausted part of her wanted to, but a larger part, older, colder, the part of her that had learned patience in wet grass under a night sky, the part that understood the value of letting a moment finish playing out instead of cutting it short out of discomfort, recognized that stopping it now would only delay what was coming. It would not prevent it. Go ahead, she said quietly. Tell her. Ashford nodded once and turned back to Paisley, and the room, every guest, every glass, every held breath, leaned in without moving an inch, waiting for the second half of a truth that was about to make the first half look small by comparison. The scenario that failed you, he said, was built off a methodology developed by Major Harlow Sinclair. Your sister designed the framework the entire evaluation board still uses. Has for 3 years now. He paused, letting that settle, watching it land on Paisley's face in real time. Which means, Captain, whether either of you knew it, walking into that ballroom tonight, your sister has been quietly measuring your career against a standard of her own making since before you ever set foot in that course. Paisley didn't say anything. She didn't have anything to say. Harlow watched her sister's mouth open and close once, twice, searching for words that simply weren't there, and understood, watching that particular silence stretch out across the space between them, that this whatever came next, whatever this fractured, glittering, champagne-soaked evening turned into, was no longer a story about a call sign. It was a story about everything the name had been standing in front of, quietly, for 15 years. And it was only just beginning. The ballroom hadn't moved. Not really. 40 guests still frozen at their tables. String quartet still sitting with instruments half raised. Gift table still sagging under boxes wrapped in paper, too pretty for what this evening had turned into. But something in the air had shifted the second General Ashford said the word methodology, and Harlow felt it settle over the room like a change in barometric pressure right before a storm breaks. Because the scenario that failed you was built off a methodology developed by Major Harlow Sinclair. 11 words. That was all it took. 11 words to turn a promotion party into something else entirely, something with no name yet. Something that would need explaining for the rest of the night, and probably for a lot of nights after that. Paisley hadn't moved either. She stood there in her dress blues with the new captain's bars, still catching the overhead light, and her face had gone through 3 separate expressions in under 10 seconds. Shock first, then something that looked almost like betrayal, and underneath both of those, quieter, harder to name, something that looked a lot like fear. Wait. Her voice came out thin, thinner than Harlow had heard it in years. You built the scenario, the compromised approach one. The one that, yes, Harlow said. The one that put a mentorship flag on my file. Yes. Paisley's jaw worked for a second before anything came out. You knew. This whole time. You knew exactly what happened to me in that evaluation, and you just what? Watched me talk about it at my own party. Watched me laugh about a name that belongs to my own sister. I didn't build it to trip you up, Paisley. Didn't matter what you built it for. Paisley's voice cracked on the last word, and she pressed her lips together like she was trying to physically hold the next sentence in. It's my file. It followed me. Do you understand that? Every board I sit in front of for the rest of my career, that flag is there, because of a scenario you wrote. Harlow felt the old tiredness rise up again. The specific kind that came from being blamed for the parts of the truth other people hadn't asked to hear yet. There's more to it than the scenario, she said quietly. There's always more with you. Paisley's eyes were bright now, too bright, the particular shine that comes right before someone decides whether they're going to cry in public or not. That's the whole problem, isn't it? There's always more, and none of us ever get to hear it until some general shows up at a party and drops it on the floor in front of 40 people. Ashford, watching the exchange with the stillness of a man who understood, he'd started something he could no longer stop, cleared his throat. Captain, he said, if it helps, I don't think your sister intended for any of this to come out tonight. It doesn't help. Paisley didn't look at him. She was looking at Harlow, and there was something raw and unguarded in her face now. Something Harlow hadn't seen since they were kids. Before the armor went up, before the performances started. It doesn't help at all, sir. Because that was the thing about truth, Harlow thought, standing there with 40 pairs of eyes on her and her sister's whole face cracking open in real time. Truth didn't care about timing. Truth didn't wait for a good moment. It just sat there, patient, until somebody with the wrong mix of pride and champagne and an old general's memory pulled the pin. And once the pin was pulled, there was no putting it back. There's something else, Ashford said, and his voice had gone quieter now. Careful. The tone of a man choosing to finish something he'd started rather than leave it half open and bleeding. Something your sister asked me not to mention tonight. I think given where we already are, it needs to be said anyway. Harlow felt her stomach drop a second time. General. Her voice came out low. A warning, the same one she'd used minutes earlier. I asked you not to. I know. Ashford met her eyes, and there was something almost apologetic in his expression, though it didn't stop him. But your sister deserves the whole picture, Major, not half of it. Half of it is what got us here in the first place. He turned back to Paisley. Do you know why your file only carries a flag, Captain? Instead of a failure notation that would have followed you into every future assignment for the rest of your career? Paisley shook her head slowly. Harlow could see her bracing for it. The way you brace before a wave you can already see building. Because someone on the evaluation board argued for you, Ashford said. Argued hard. Made the case that a technically gifted officer who ignores a spotter's correction under pressure isn't a lost cause. She's a training problem. Fixable. If somebody with the right background is willing to put in the hours. Who? Paisley's voice had dropped to almost nothing. Ashford didn't answer. He didn't have to. Harlow watched her sister's eyes move to her, slow, disbelieving, the pieces sliding into place one after another with an almost audible click. You, Paisley said. You did that, for me. Yes. Paisley's voice broke properly this time. After everything I've said to you. Every stupid comment, every joke I made at your expense, every time I told people you were the desk sister. You stopped. Started again, quieter. Why would you do that? Harlow felt the answer sitting right there in her chest, simple and complicated, at the same time, the way the truest things usually were. Because you're my sister, she said. And because I know exactly how good you could be if somebody ever pushed you to actually listen instead of just perform. The room had gone very quiet again. Walter stepped forward before anyone else could speak, and something in his face had changed since the last time Harlow had looked at him directly. The confusion was still there, but underneath it now sat something that looked almost like grief, the particular grief of a man realizing a story he'd told himself for years had been wrong the entire time. Harlow. He said her name carefully, like he was testing whether it still meant what he thought it meant. You did that. Knowing what she said about you. Knowing how she's talked about you at every family dinner for the last 5 years. Yes. Why didn't you tell us? Any of it. The methodology. The recommendation. Why let us believe? He stopped, unable to finish the sentence, and Harlow understood, watching him struggle, that he genuinely didn't know how to say the rest of it out loud. Why let us believe you were less than you are? Because telling you, Harlow said, has never actually worked, Dad. I tried. More than once. You just don't remember it. Because it never landed the way it needed to. That's not fair. It's the 3rd time tonight somebody's said that to me. Harlow felt something sharp rise in her chest, cutting through the exhaustion for a moment. Maybe it's worth asking why. Walter didn't have an answer for that either. And in the silence that followed, real silence now, the string quartet still frozen, 40 guests still holding champagne glasses they'd forgotten they were holding. Harlow understood that whatever this family had been for the last 15 years, it wasn't going to survive tonight in the same shape. Something had cracked open in front of witnesses. And cracked things, once you could see all the way through them, didn't close back up just because everyone wanted the party to keep going. Ashford cleared his throat again, gently this time. I think, he said, I should go. I didn't come here to do this. No, Harlow said. You just came here to say hello to an old friend's daughter. I understand, sir. Really? He nodded once, and looked at her for a long moment, something unspoken passing between them, the particular respect that only exists between people who've spent time in rooms neither of them can ever fully describe to anyone else. For what it's worth, he said quietly, before he turned to go, the scenario you built saved somebody's life last spring. A candidate almost made the exact mistake your sister made. Different circumstances. Same instinct, trust yourself over the correction. He caught it in time. Because your framework taught him to expect that exact failure in himself before it happened. He left without waiting for a response. Harlow watched him go, watched the doors swing shut behind him, and felt the ballroom exhale slowly around her. 40 people finally remembering they had bodies, glasses, conversations to return to. Except nobody returned to anything. The party, whatever it had been an hour ago, was over now, in every way that mattered. Guests began drifting toward the coat check in 2s and 3s, murmuring, the particular murmur people use when they've witnessed something they weren't supposed to see, and don't yet know how to talk about it. Diane hadn't said a word this entire time. She stood a few feet away, one hand still pressed against her collarbone, and when Harlow finally looked at her directly, she saw something that looked almost like recognition. Not of the facts. Diane had clearly absorbed the facts, the rank, the methodology, the recommendation, all of it landing somewhere behind her carefully composed face. What Harlow saw was recognition of something older, something closer to guilt. Mom. Harlow's voice was quiet now, most of the anger burned out of it, leaving something flatter and more tired underneath. You want to say anything? Diane opened her mouth, closed it again. "I think," she said finally, "we should go home. All of us. And talk about this somewhere that isn't." She gestured weakly at the room, the banner, the abandoned champagne glasses. "Somewhere that isn't this." "You keep saying that too," Harlow said. "Somewhere else. Some other time. Because this isn't the place, Harlow." "When is the place, Mom?" Harlow felt her voice rise despite herself, despite years of training that told her rising voices lost arguments instead of winning them. "You've had 15 years of places. Every single one of them was the wrong one. So forgive me if I don't believe there's a right one coming." Diane's face crumpled, just slightly, at the edges, and for a moment Harlow thought her mother might actually cry, right there in the middle of the emptying ballroom. She didn't. Diane Sinclair had spent 30 years perfecting the art of not crying in public, and whatever else had changed tonight, that particular skill hadn't gone anywhere. "I'm sorry," she said instead. Quiet, almost inaudible under the sound of chairs being stacked by the catering staff at the edges of the room. I don't know what else to say right now. I'm sorry. It wasn't enough." Harlow knew, even as her mother said it, that it wasn't enough not because Diane didn't mean it, but because an apology that arrived without specifics, without the weight of actually naming what it was sorry for, tended to evaporate the moment it left the room. She'd learned that a long time ago. Sorry was easy. Sorry cost nothing. What cost something was sitting with the actual list of what happened, out loud, without flinching away from it. Nobody in this family was ready for that list yet. Not tonight. Harlow picked up her clutch from the drink table, where she'd set it down, what felt like a lifetime ago, though the clock on the far wall said it had been less than 20 minutes since Ashford's salute cracked the evening in half. 20 minutes. That was all it had taken to unravel 15 years. "I have an early flight," she said, and the line came out automatically, the same clean exit she'd used at 100 family gatherings before this one. Except tonight it didn't feel like an exit at all. It felt like fleeing a building that was still on fire. Harlow Walter started. "I'll call you," she said, and she wasn't entirely sure it was true when she said it. "When I land, we'll talk." Not tonight. She left before anyone could answer. The parking lot was cold, the kind of early spring cold that still had winter's teeth in it, and Harlow stood by her car for a long moment without unlocking it, just breathing, watching her own breath fog faintly in the security lights. Behind her, through the venue's tall windows, she could see the party finishing its slow collapse guests, filtering out in small clusters, the string quartet packing up their instruments, the banner still hanging crooked over a room that had stopped being a celebration a long time before anyone officially called it. She didn't cry. She'd trained that reflex out of herself a long time ago, the same way she'd trained out flinching at gunfire and hesitating before a difficult call. It didn't mean she didn't feel it. It meant the feeling went somewhere else instead, down into her chest, into a tight, coiled place that would need unwinding eventually. Just not tonight, not in a parking lot with mascara she hadn't bothered wearing, and a family inside that building still trying to figure out who she actually was. She got in the car, sat there for a moment with her hands on the wheel, the same way she had before walking in. Then she drove home and didn't think about any of it again until 3 days later, when Paisley showed up at her office door. The office wasn't much, a converted classroom in a low brick building on the training side of the base, government beige walls, a window that looked out over a gravel yard where recruits ran timed courses before dawn most mornings. Harlow had requisitioned it 2 years ago when she'd taken over the evaluation framework program full-time, and she'd never bothered decorating it beyond the essentials. A desk, 2 chairs, a whiteboard she used more than the computer, a single framed photo on the shelf behind her, not of family, not of a ceremony, just a faded shot of a training class from years back, most of the faces in it people she'd lost touch with or lost entirely. She was at that desk at 745 on a Thursday morning, coffee cooling beside a stack of evaluation files, when she heard the knock. 3 knocks. Even, deliberate. Not the knock of someone dropping by casually. "Come in." The door opened, and Paisley stood in the frame. No dress uniform this time. Service uniform, plain, no ribbons on display, and Harlow noticed immediately that her sister looked different than she had. At the party, hollowed out somehow. The particular exhaustion of someone who hadn't slept much and had decided sleep wasn't the priority anyway. She had a manila folder tucked under one arm. "Can I come in?" Paisley said. "Not quite a question. You're already in." Paisley almost smiled at that. Almost. She crossed the small office and sat down in the chair across from the desk without being asked, setting the folder down between them like an offering, or maybe evidence. Harlow couldn't quite tell which yet. For a long moment, neither of them said anything. "I want to know what I did wrong," Paisley said finally. No apology first. No preamble. Just the question, direct, stripped of every performance. Harlow had watched her sister give at every family gathering for the last decade. Harlow studied her for a moment, because there was a version of this conversation that could go easy, a version where she softened everything, framed it as an accident of pressure and inexperience, let her sister off the hook the way a sister might, out of love, out of the desire to stop the bleeding as quickly as possible. She wasn't going to give her that version. "Walk me through it," Harlow said instead. "Not what you told Mom and Dad. Not the version where the instructor was just being hard on you because you were too good. What actually happened? In your head, during the compromised approach scenario." Paisley's jaw tightened. For a second, Harlow thought she might get up and leave, might retreat back into the armor, back into the performance. She didn't. "My spotter flagged a discrepancy," Paisley said slowly. "Wind red didn't match what I was seeing through the scope. He called it out. Twice. And I ignored it." The words came out flatter now, more honest. "I thought I was right. I was so sure I was right that I didn't think his correction was worth the time it would cost me to double-check it. Were you right?" Paisley was quiet for a long moment. "No," she said finally. "I wasn't." Harlow nodded slowly and let the silence sit there for a beat before she spoke again. "That's not actually the problem, Paisley." Paisley looked up confused. "What do you mean, that's not the problem? I made the wrong call. Isn't that the whole?" "Being wrong happens to everyone." Harlow tapped the folder between them, still unopened. "Even people who are exceptionally good at what they do. Especially people who are exceptionally good at what they do because they've had less practice being wrong, which means they've had less practice recognizing it in the moment it's happening." Huh. She let that land before continuing. "The problem isn't that you made an incorrect call. The problem is that you didn't leave room for the possibility you might be wrong in the first place. That's a different failure, a more dangerous one." Paisley sat with that for a long moment, and Harlow watched something behind her sister's eyes shift, slowly, the way ice shifts before it finally cracks all the way through. "Were you ever scared?" Paisley asked eventually. Her voice had lost the edge it usually carried, the performance stripped down to something almost young. "Doing what you did. Were you ever actually afraid?" "Constantly," Harlow said without hesitation. Paisley blinked. Clearly not the answer she'd expected. Harlow could see, watching her sister process it, that some part of Paisley had built her into the same myth. The instructors had Black Viper, fearless, untouchable, a name meant to intimidate rather than a person who had actually lived through the specific, cold fear that came with the job. "Fear isn't weakness," Harlow said. "It's information. It tells you something matters, that the stakes are real, that you should be paying closer attention than you currently are. Arrogance is what happens when you stop listening to that information, because you've decided you already know everything you need to know." She watched that settle into her sister the way it needed to. "Every time I've almost gotten something badly wrong," she added, quieter now. "It started with a moment exactly like the one you had with your spotter. Somebody offering a correction. Me deciding in a half-second that I didn't need it. A pause. The difference between the times I listened and the times I didn't is the entire difference between the career I have and the one I could have lost." Paisley didn't say anything for a long time. Then, finally, "So what do we do about it?" Harlow reached across the desk and opened the folder her sister had brought Paisley's evaluation file, the same one she'd already read 3 times before this morning, though she let her eyes move over it again anyway. Giving her sister the courtesy of feeling like this was a shared discovery instead of a lecture. "We start over," she said. "Not the scores. Those don't change, but the instinct underneath them that we can rebuild. Twice a week became the rhythm. Tuesdays and Thursdays, 700 to 900, before the bass fully woke up around them, in the same converted classroom, with the same government beige walls, and the same window looking out over the gravel training yard. Harlow didn't make it easy. She didn't think Paisley wanted it easy. Not really, not underneath the parts of her that still bristled every time a correction landed a little too close to the center of something she'd built her whole identity around. They ran scenario after scenario. Simulated positioning, simulated spotter calls, simulated discrepancies buried inside data that looked clean until you knew exactly where to look. Harlow watched her sister's first instinct, every single time, and it was always the same. Trust the read. Trust the training. Trust the version of herself that had finished top of her class and had never once, in her entire career, been forced to sit with being wrong in a room where nobody was clapping for her. It took 4 sessions before something started to shift. It took 6 weeks before it broke her. The morning it happened, Harlow had built a scenario deliberately more difficult than anything they'd run before. Layered corrections, contradictory data, a spotter call that arrived at the worst possible moment, designed to expose exactly the instinct they'd been working to unlearn. Paisley failed it badly, worse than she had in the actual evaluation months earlier, and Harlow watched her sister's hands go still on the desk, watched something in her face collapse inward in a way she hadn't seen since the ballroom. "I can't do this," Paisley said. Her voice was flat, not dramatic. Worse than dramatic, hollowed out, the sound of someone who had genuinely stopped believing something instead of just performing the doubt for effect. "You just did it," Harlow said. "Badly. That's different from can't. I keep making the exact same mistake." Paisley's hands curled into fists on the desk, not in anger, in something closer to helplessness. Over and over, every single session. What if this is who I am? What if I'm not actually built to listen, and you've spent 6 weeks trying to fix something that just isn't fixable? "Paisley, I finished top of my class." Her voice cracked. "Top. And I still can't get this right. Maybe the instructor was right the first time. Maybe I'm exactly what everyone's always said. Good at the parts that get applause. Bad at the parts that actually matter." Harlow felt something tighten in her own chest, watching her sister, the loud one, the golden one, the one who had never once in her life seemed to need anyone's reassurance, sit across a desk from her, looking like she might actually walk away from her own career. She didn't reach for comfort. Comfort wasn't what this moment needed. "Let me tell you something," Harlow said instead, "that I've never told anyone outside a training room." Paisley looked up. "My first year in the program, I failed a live scenario badly enough that they almost pulled me. Not almost like a manner of speaking. Almost like there was a meeting and my name was on a list, and somebody had to argue to keep me in it." Harlow kept her voice even, steady, the same steady she used on every difficult truth. "I spent 2 weeks after that certain I didn't belong there. Certain everyone in that program had made a mistake letting me in, and it was only a matter of time before they figured it out." "What changed?" "Somebody told me the same thing I'm about to tell you." Harlow leaned forward slightly. "The people who never fail a scenario like this aren't the ones who are good enough to skip it. They're the ones who never got tested hard enough to find the crack in the first place. You found yours 6 weeks into a program most people never get invited to at all. That's not failure, Paisley. That's the process working exactly the way it's supposed to." Paisley didn't answer right away. Her eyes were wet, though she wasn't letting the tears actually fall, holding them back the same stubborn way Harlow had watched her hold back everything uncomfortable for her entire life. "I don't want to be someone who quits," Paisley said finally. "Then don't." Harlow's voice softened, just slightly. Run it again. They ran it again. She failed it again, and a third time. And on the 4th attempt, something finally shifted. Not perfect, not clean, but different. A half-second hesitation before her sister committed to a read. A half-second that hadn't existed 6 weeks earlier. The exact half-second the entire program was built to create. "There," Harlow said quietly. "That's it. That's the whole thing." Paisley let out a breath that sounded like it had been sitting in her chest for weeks. "It doesn't feel like anything," she said. "It's not supposed to feel like anything yet. It's supposed to feel like nothing." For a long time, until one day it saves your life and you don't even remember deciding to listen. That's when you'll know it's actually there. It was the following week that Colonel Grayson Halstead walked into the program for the first time. Harlow knew him by reputation before she ever knew him by face, a name that came up occasionally in the older circles of the evaluation community, always attached to a particular tone, the tone people used for someone who had been powerful long enough to stop noticing how much room he took up in a room. He held a senior advisory position on the training command staff, one level removed from directly overseeing programs like Harlow's, close enough to have opinions, far enough to rarely have to answer for them. He arrived unannounced on a Tuesday morning, mid-session, letting himself into the converted classroom without knocking, and stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching Harlow walk Paisley through a positioning exercise, before either of them noticed him. Major Sinclair. His voice was smooth, the kind of smooth that had been practiced for decades, honed in briefing rooms and promotion boards until it sounded effortless. I've heard interesting things about your little project here. Harlow straightened, and beside her, Paisley did the same, both of them coming to a loose attention out of instinct. Colonel. Harlow kept her voice level. Can I help you with something? Just observing. He stepped further into the room, hands clasped behind his back, eyes moving over the whiteboard, the scenario notes, the two of them standing at the center of a program that had, until this moment, existed largely outside anyone's direct attention. One-on-one mentorship, unusual approach for a formal evaluation flag. It's within program guidelines. I'm aware. He smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. I helped write some of those guidelines, Major. Long before your name was on any evaluation framework. Something in that sentence landed wrong, though Harlow couldn't immediately place why a small, cold undercurrent beneath the pleasant tone, the sound of a man reminding her, gently, precisely, of a hierarchy she was apparently expected to remember. Captain Sinclair is making significant progress, Harlow said. I'd be happy to walk you through the data if that's useful. Not necessary. Halstead's eyes moved to Paisley, and something in his expression shifted, assessing, almost proprietary. Captain, I reviewed your file before I came down here. Impressive scores, concerning flag. Sir, Paisley's voice was careful, measured none of the easy confidence from the party 6 weeks earlier. I'm working on it. So I've heard. He turned back to Harlow. You understand, Major, that a mentorship flag of this nature is typically resolved in a matter of weeks, not months. The board will want to see her cleared for her next assignment cycle. Sitting under an informal remediation program indefinitely isn't in anyone's interest. Least of all, with respect, sir, 6 weeks isn't unusual for the depth of correction required here. With respect, Major, Halstead echoed, and there was an edge under the pleasantness now, thin but unmistakable. I don't believe depth of correction is actually the variable in question. Harlow felt her spine go rigid. What variable are you suggesting, sir? He didn't answer directly. He let his eyes move around the room one more time. Slow, deliberate, the particular unhurried pace of a man who had never once in his career needed to explain himself faster than he wanted to. I'll be attending Captain Sinclair's formal reassessment board myself, he said instead. When it's scheduled, I find these programs benefit from senior oversight. A pause, especially ones built around unconventional methodology. He left without waiting for a response, the same way Ashford had 6 weeks earlier, though the silence he left behind carried an entirely different weight, not the heavy, unfinished silence of a truth just spoken, but something colder. Something that felt, to Harlow, standing in the middle of her own classroom, with her sister watching her carefully, a great deal like a threat dressed up as institutional interest. Who was that? Paisley asked quietly, once the door had closed. Colonel Grayson Halstead, Training Command. Harlow was still looking at the closed door. I've heard the name. Never worked with him directly. He didn't seem to like you very much. No, Harlow said slowly. He didn't. She didn't think much more about it that day. There was too much else the session to finish, the next week's scenarios to build, the slow, careful work of watching her sister rebuild an instinct one repetition at a time. It wasn't until 3 nights later, digging through an old personnel archive for an unrelated reference case, that Harlow found the thread that would unravel exactly why Colonel Grayson Halstead had looked at her the way he had. She hadn't been looking for it. That was the strange part. The part that would sit with her for days afterward. She'd been searching the archive for a case reference from years back, something to use in a new training scenario, and the search had returned an adjacent file she hadn't requested. A commendation recommendation. Her own name on it, dated 5 years earlier, filed and then, somewhere in the review chain, simply stopped. She almost closed the file without reading it. Old commendation paperwork rarely meant anything by the time it surfaced, this late approved, denied, forgotten. The outcome usually recorded somewhere in the first page. There was no outcome recorded. The file simply ended, mid-review, at a signature block that had never been completed. And the name on the final reviewing signature line, the officer who had received the recommendation, and apparently never acted on it, never approved it, never denied it, just let it sit until it aged out of relevance entirely, was Colonel Grayson Halstead. Harlow sat very still in her office for a long moment, the old fluorescent light humming overhead, the gravel yard outside dark and empty at this hour. Because that recommendation, she remembered it now, distantly, the way you remember something you'd trained yourself not to think about. A field commendation, put forward by her own commanding officer at the time, for an operation that had gone almost entirely unrecognized outside a small circle of people who already knew what she'd done. She'd been told, years ago, that it simply hadn't made it through review. Paperwork got lost sometimes. That was the explanation she'd been given, and she'd accepted it the way she'd accepted most things about her career that never quite added up to what they should have quietly, without pushing, because pushing rarely changed anything, and mostly just cost you political capital you couldn't afford to spend. It hadn't gotten lost. It had been buried, deliberately, by a man who 5 years later was about to sit on the board, deciding her sister's future. She read the file 3 more times, checking dates, checking signatures, making sure she wasn't building a conspiracy out of a coincidence her tired mind wanted to see. She wasn't. The dates lined up. Halstead had been in exactly the position to receive that recommendation, exactly the position to let it die quietly instead of advancing it, and had done precisely that, for reasons the file gave no explanation for, and Harlow suspected she'd never get a straight answer to now, which meant the man who'd walked into her classroom a few days earlier hadn't been reviewing a training program. He'd been checking on a threat. Because if Harlow Sinclair's name carried weight, real weight, the kind that got acknowledged instead of buried, then every quiet decision Halstead had made about her over the years, every recommendation he'd let die, every credit he'd never passed along, sat exposed in a way it hadn't been before. A woman nobody noticed was safe to overlook. A woman with a 2-star general saluting her in a crowded ballroom, and a mentorship success story taking shape under her direct supervision, was not. Harlow closed the file slowly. She didn't sleep much that night, running the timeline again and again in her head, trying to decide what any of this actually meant for Paisley's upcoming board. Because if Halstead had buried her recommendation once, quietly, without consequence, there was no reason to believe he'd hesitate to do something similar now, with far more at stake and far less time to catch it. She got her answer sooner than she expected. It came 3 weeks later, on an ordinary Tuesday. During what should have been an ordinary session, except that morning, Harlow had planned something different. Not another classroom scenario. A live field exercise, the kind the program rarely used this early in a remediation cycle. But Paisley had earned it. 6 months of consistent, hard-won progress, and Harlow wanted her sister to feel what listening actually cost and saved in real terrain, not just simulated data on a screen. They were 3 hours into a training range on the western edge of the base, running a 2-person reconnaissance training drill with a live safety officer overseeing from a distance, when the radio crackled with something that wasn't part of the script, an actual medical emergency. A younger Marine on an adjacent range, heat exhaustion turning into something worse, faster than the on-site corpsman could stabilize, and the nearest qualified evacuation team still 6 minutes out by vehicle. Harlow didn't hesitate. She was moving before she'd fully processed the decision, cutting across open terrain toward the adjacent range, with Paisley half a step behind her, training kit abandoned, everything in her narrowing down to the specific, practiced calm that 5 years of fieldwork had built into her like muscle. She reached the downed Marine, a young private, barely out of boot camp, skin gray and slick with sweat, breathing shallow and wrong, and dropped into the exact steady rhythm she'd spent years learning to trust under pressure. Air, way, cooling, positioning, calling out vitals to the corpsman in short, clipped sentences that left no room for panic to find a foothold. Paisley worked beside her without being told what to do, matching her sister's rhythm almost perfectly, anticipating the next need a half second before Harlow asked for it. Water, shade, the young Marine's boots elevated, someone's jacket rolled under his head. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't cinematic. It was 6 minutes of careful, unglamorous work that ended with the evacuation team arriving to find a stable patient instead of a crisis, and a young private who would walk out of the base hospital that evening with nothing worse than a stern lecture about hydration. Nobody clapped. Nobody saluted. There was no ballroom, no audience, no gold cursive banner announcing what had just happened. But afterward, sitting on the tailgate of a parked vehicle, while the range slowly returned to normal around them, Paisley looked at her sister with an expression Harlow hadn't seen on her face before. Not admiration exactly. Something quieter than that. Something closer to understanding. "That's it, isn't it?" Paisley said. "That's the whole thing you've been trying to teach me. Not the scenarios, not the data. This. 6 minutes where nobody has time to be wrong twice. Most of the job is exactly like that," Harlow said. "The parts that end up in a story are almost never the parts that mattered." Paisley was quiet for a while, watching the sun start to drop toward the tree line at the edge of the range. "I used to think you were hiding something," she said finally. "All those years. I thought I don't know what I thought, that you were embarrassed maybe. Or that there wasn't actually much to tell, and the mystery was covering for something ordinary. And now I think you just never found a version of this." She gestured at the range, the empty field, the two of them sitting together in a silence that felt for the first time in years uncomplicated, that fit at a dinner table. "And I think that's on all of us, not just you." It was the closest thing to an apology Paisley had offered since the party, and Harlow let it sit there without pushing for more. Some things needed time to finish arriving. She'd learned that a long time ago, in wet grass under a night sky, waiting for a moment that would only work if she let it come on its own. They drove back to the classroom in near silence, the good kind, and it was there, checking her email before locking up for the evening, that Harlow found the message that would end whatever fragile peace the last few weeks had built. It came from an administrative account she didn't recognize at first, a routine-looking notice about an upcoming board schedule. Paisley's formal reassessment moved up, not by weeks, by days. A new date, 3 weeks earlier than the original timeline. Harlow had built the entire remediation program around, with a note at the bottom indicating the change had been requested and approved at the training command level. Approved by Colonel Grayson Halstead. Harlow read it twice, feeling the same cold slide of understanding she'd felt reading the buried commendation file weeks earlier. 3 weeks. That was all it would take to turn a genuine success story into a rushed, underprepared evaluation, timed precisely to catch Paisley's progress before it had fully solidified, timed precisely by the one man in the entire chain who had every reason to want this program to fail. She opened a second file, one she'd requested access to earlier that week, out of simple due diligence. The underlying data package the reassessment board would use scoring baselines, comparison metrics, the raw numbers against which Paisley's progress would be measured. Something in the numbers didn't match what Harlow had recorded herself, session by session, over 6 months of careful tracking. Small discrepancies, the kind that could be explained away individually, a rounding error here, a mislabeled data point there, except they weren't random. Harlow pulled up her own records beside the official package, cross-referencing line by line, feeling her pulse pick up with every mismatch that surfaced. Every single discrepancy ran in the same direction. Down. Every one of them, shaving Paisley's documented progress just slightly lower than what had actually happened in that classroom. In that range, over 6 months of real, hard-won work small enough that no single number would raise a flag on its own, large enough, in aggregate, to make a genuine transformation look like a marginal, unconvincing improvement to anyone reviewing the file cold. Harlow sat very still in the quiet classroom, the gravel yard dark outside the window, and understood, with a clarity that settled into her chest like ice water, exactly what she was looking at. Somebody had gotten into the data, and there was only one name on the approval chain, with both the access and the motive to make her sister's hard-won progress simply disappear before it ever reached a boardroom. Harlow sat in the dark for a long time after she found it, not moving, not breathing right, because there is a particular kind of stillness that comes over a person when they finally see the shape of something they'd only felt the edges of before. And this was that stillness, cold and complete, settling into her chest like water finding the bottom of a glass. Every number shaved down, every single one. Not random, not careless, deliberate. She scrolled back through the file again, slower this time, because she needed to be sure. Because being wrong about this, being the kind of wrong that came from anger instead of evidence, would cost her sister more than Halstead ever could on his own. She wasn't wrong. 6 months of data. 6 months of Tuesdays and Thursdays, 700 to 900, in a converted classroom with government beige walls. 6 months of watching her sister fail and finally, slowly, stop failing. All of it real. All of it documented, session by session, in Harlow's own careful hand. And someone had gone in after the fact and made it smaller. Her phone was already in her hand before she'd fully decided to call. Paisley picked up on the second ring, her voice thick with something between sleep and dread, the particular tone people use at 10 at night when a call from a sister, who never calls this late, can only mean something has gone wrong. Harlow, what's happening? I need you to come in tomorrow, early, before your shift. Why? What's wrong? Harlow closed her eyes, because there was no easy way to say this, because the moment she said it out loud, it stopped being a private, cold suspicion sitting in her own chest and became something real, something that would have to be dealt with, something that could not, once spoken, be unspoken again. Somebody's been altering your file, she said. I think it's Halstead. Silence on the other end of the line. Long enough that Harlow checked to see if the call had dropped. Say that again, Paisley said finally. Very quiet. The board moved your reassessment up. 3 weeks early, he approved it. Harlow kept her voice level, the trained kind of level, even though nothing in her chest felt level at all. And the data package they're going to use. It doesn't match my records. Every discrepancy runs the same direction. Down. That's not possible. I wish it wasn't. Harlow. Paisley's voice had an edge in it now, sharp, the particular fear that comes dressed as anger, because anger is easier to hold on to. If that's true, if somebody's actually doing that, that's not a mistake. That's not an oversight. I know what it is. So what do we do? Harlow looked at the 2 files open side by side on her screen, her own careful records, 6 months of honest work, and the sanitized version, smaller, quieter, engineered to make a genuine transformation look like nothing worth noticing. We prove it, she said, before the board sits. When's the board? Harlow checked the notice again, the timestamp glaring back at her from the screen. 9 days. Because 9 days was not a lot of time. Because building a case against a colonel with 15 years of institutional weight behind him, using nothing but her own field notes and a gut feeling about a buried commendation file, was not the kind of thing anyone did successfully in 9 days. Except she was going to try anyway. Because the alternative was watching her sister walk into that room with a rigged file and no idea what was waiting for her. I'll be there at 500, Paisley said. Tell me what to bring. Bring everything, Harlow said. Every note, every worksheet, every session log you've kept on your own. We're going to need all of it. She didn't sleep that night. Old habit, resurrected without effort. The particular wakefulness that used to keep her alert through 17-hour positions in wet grass now redirected toward a laptop screen and a stack of paper files spread across her kitchen table. By 300, she had a working theory. By 430, she had the beginning of a timeline. And when Paisley knocked on her office door at 500 sharp, a duffel bag of loose paperwork slung over one shoulder, dark circles under her eyes that matched her sister's exactly. Harlow had already cleared the whiteboard and started mapping it out in dry erase marker. Session dates down the left side, documented scores beside them, and beside those, in a different color, the numbers from the official package Halstead's office had circulated. The gap between the two columns widened, session by session, the further along the timeline you went. "Look at this," Harlow said, tapping the board. "Early sessions. Barely any difference. A point here, half a point there. Small enough nobody would ever question it. And then it gets worse. The closer we get to now, the bigger the gap." Harlow circled the last 3 sessions, the ones from the field exercise weeks earlier, the ones where Paisley's actual performance had been the strongest of the entire program. These are the ones that matter most to a board. Recent performance, trend line, and these are exactly the ones somebody worked hardest to flatten. Paisley stared at the board for a long moment, arms crossed, jaw tight. "He's trying to make it look like I plateaued," she said slowly. "Like 6 months of work barely moved the needle." "Yes. Why? What does he even get out of that?" Harlow hesitated. Because this was the part she hadn't told her sister yet, the part that had kept her up past 3 in the morning, turning over 5-year-old paperwork she'd almost forgotten existed. "I found something," she said, "a few weeks ago, before any of this started." "What kind of something?" "A commendation recommendation, mine, from 5 years ago." Harlow pulled up the scanned file on her laptop, turned the screen toward her sister. "It never went anywhere. I was told it got lost somewhere in review. Turns out it didn't get lost. It got buried. By him." Paisley leaned in, scanning the file, her eyes narrowing as she reached the incomplete signature block at the bottom. He just sat on it. For 5 years. Why would he do that? Harlow shook her head slowly. "I don't know for certain, but I have a guess." She closed the laptop, met her sister's eyes. "If my record had gone through the way it should have, I'd have had more visibility, more weight behind anything I said, anything I built, including a training methodology he'd have had a much harder time quietly criticizing behind closed doors." "You think this is about him, protecting his own position?" "I think," Harlow said carefully, that a man who spends 15 years accumulating quiet influence doesn't love watching someone underneath him start accumulating it too, especially not someone he already tried to keep small once before." Paisley was quiet for a long moment, absorbing that, and Harlow watched something shift behind her sister's eyes, not just anger now, something colder, more focused. "So he did it to you first," Paisley said, "and now he's doing it to me. Except this time it's not just burying credit, it's actively rigging a board. That's what it looks like. Then we don't just fix my file." Paisley's voice had steadied, the fear giving way to something harder underneath it. "We prove what he did to both of us. At the same time. In front of people who can't ignore it." Harlow felt something in her own chest loosen, just slightly, at the sound of that. Because for the first time in longer than she could remember, her sister wasn't asking to be protected. She was asking to fight. "That's going to be harder," Harlow said, "and riskier. If we're wrong about any piece of this, we're not wrong." Paisley set her duffel bag down on the desk, started pulling out folders, notebooks, printed session logs she'd apparently kept on her own without ever mentioning it. "I've got my own notes. Every session, I wrote down my own scores after every drill, because I didn't trust myself to remember them accurately later. Compare them to what's in that official package." Harlow stared at the stack of paper in front of her. "You kept independent records." "I kept independent records," Paisley said, "because you taught me not to trust a single source blindly. Even my own memory. Especially my own memory." A small, tired smile flickered at the corner of her mouth. "Turns out that lesson's useful for more than wind calls." They worked through the morning without stopping, cross-referencing Paisley's handwritten logs, against Harlow's official records and the doctored package. Halstead's office had circulated, building a paper trail, 3 sources deep, each one corroborating the other, each one making it harder and harder for anyone to dismiss what they were building as coincidence or misunderstanding. By noon, the whiteboard was covered edge to edge. By evening, they had a spreadsheet mapping every discrepancy, time-stamped, sourced, cross-checked twice, and by the 4th day, they had something else. It came from an unexpected place, a records clerk in the training command office, a young corporal named Reyes, who'd handled the file transfer requests for Paisley's reassessment package, and mentioned, almost in passing when Harlow stopped by with a routine question, that the request to expedite the board timeline hadn't come through normal channels. Normal channels? Harlow kept her voice casual. Old instinct, don't spook a source before you know what they actually have. Usually those requests come through the program officer first, Reyes said. Yours would have been you, ma'am. This one came straight from Colonel Halstead's office, bypassed the usual review. Is that unusual? Reyes hesitated. A little, ma'am. Not unheard of, but usually there's a reason attached. Medical timeline, deployment conflict, something like that. This one just said priority review requested. No reason given. Harlow filed that away carefully, thanked the corporal, and walked back to her office with the last piece of the picture finally settling into place. Halstead hadn't just altered the data. He'd rushed the timeline specifically to keep anyone from having enough time to catch what he'd done, which meant he knew, on some level, that the numbers wouldn't survive close scrutiny. Which meant this wasn't a man confident in his own cover. This was a man racing a clock he'd set himself, hoping speed would do what certainty couldn't. That gave Harlow something she hadn't had 4 days earlier: leverage. She spent the 5th day building a formal packet, every discrepancy documented, every source cited, the timeline of the buried commendation laid out beside the timeline of the accelerated board, the pattern impossible to read as anything but deliberate once you saw both pieces side by side. The question that remained, the one that kept her up, staring at the ceiling on the 6th night, was who to actually hand it to. Because handing evidence like this to the wrong person, someone loyal to Halstead, someone who owed him something, someone who simply wouldn't want the institutional headache of a colonel accused of manipulating a junior officer's file, could bury the whole thing just as effectively as Halstead had buried her commendation 5 years earlier. Maybe more effectively, because this time it would look like it had been properly reviewed and found lacking, instead of simply disappearing into a drawer. She needed someone with enough rank to matter, enough integrity to actually look at what she was handing him, instead of filing it away to avoid a conflict, and enough distance from Halstead that loyalty wouldn't cloud the read. There was only one name that fit all 3. She called Ashford on the 7th morning, sitting in her car in the base parking lot before sunrise, watching her own breath fog against the windshield, the same way it had in a different parking lot on the night of the party. He picked up on the 3rd ring. Major Sinclair. His voice was careful, guarded in the way of a man who suspected this call would not be simple. I wondered if I'd hear from you again. I need 10 minutes, sir. In person, if you can manage it. It's about my sister's reassessment board. A pause on the line. The one that's been moved up. Yes, sir. I heard about that. Another pause, longer this time. I also heard some things about the timeline that didn't sit well with me, if I'm honest. Come by my office at 1400. Bring whatever you have. She arrived at 1355. Packet under one arm, Paisley beside her, both of them in service uniform, both of them steadier than they'd felt at any point in the last week, despite the exhaustion sitting heavy behind their eyes. Ashford's office was larger than Harlow's, cleaner, the kind of space that came with rank and time-framed commendations on one wall, a window looking out over the main parade ground instead of a gravel training yard. He gestured them into the 2 chairs across from his desk without much preamble. Let's hear it, he said. Harlow laid the packet on the desk and walked him through it. Slowly, methodically, the way she'd been trained to brief anything that mattered: facts first, interpretation second, nothing stated as certain that wasn't actually certain. She showed him the whiteboard photos, the cross-referenced spreadsheets, Paisley's independent logs sitting alongside the official numbers with the gaps circled in red. She showed him the buried commendation file, 5 years old, her own name on it, the signature block that had never been completed. She watched his face as he went through it, page by page, and said nothing until he was finished. He was quiet for a long time after he closed the folder. "You understand what you're accusing a full colonel of," he said finally. "Not unkindly, just precisely, the way a man speaks when he needs the weight of a thing understood before anyone moves forward with it." "Yes, sir. This isn't a small thing to walk back once it's on the record. If you're right, it ends his career. If you're wrong, he didn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to." "I'm not wrong, sir," Harlow said. "But I understand what I'm asking." Ashford leaned back in his chair, studying her for a long moment, and then turned his attention to Paisley, who had said almost nothing through the entire briefing, sitting straight-backed in her chair with her jaw set. "Captain, this is your career on the line more than anyone else's in this room. What do you want to do?" Paisley didn't hesitate. "I want the truth on the record, sir, whatever that costs." Something in Ashford's expression shifted, not quite a smile, but something adjacent to approval, the particular look of a senior officer watching a junior one choose the harder, correcter path without flinching. "All right," he said. "Here's what happens next." He explained it in clean, deliberate steps. He would personally request a data integrity review of the reassessment package, citing the discrepancies Harlow had documented, routing it through a channel that bypassed Halstead's office entirely. He would preside over the reassessment board himself, given the questions now attached to the file's chain of custody, and he would make it clear, in writing, that any attempt to further alter or expedite the process before the review concluded would itself be treated as evidence. "He'll know something's coming," Ashford said. "There's no way to do this quietly and still do it right. But he won't know exactly what, or from where until the board sits. That's the best protection I can offer either of you in the meantime." "That's enough, sir," Harlow said. "Thank you. Don't thank me yet." Ashford's expression had gone serious again. "If this goes the way the evidence suggests it will, it's going to be an ugly 9 days. For all three of you. Halstead doesn't strike me as a man who goes quietly." He was right. Word moved fast in a base this size, faster than Harlow would have liked, and by the second day after the meeting with Ashford, it was clear Halstead had heard something, even if the specifics hadn't reached him yet. He appeared at Harlow's office unannounced again, the same way he had months earlier, except this time there was no pretense of pleasant observation in his expression. "Major." He didn't sit, didn't ask to, just stood in the doorway, arms crossed, something cold and careful sitting behind his eyes. "I understand there's been some inquiry into the reassessment package." "There has, sir. Care to tell me why?" Harlow met his gaze steadily. "Because there was a version of this conversation where she softened it, where she gave him room to walk something back quietly before it became irreversible. She'd considered that version briefly in the sleepless hours of the last week. She wasn't going to give it to him. There were discrepancies between the official data package and the independent records my sister and I kept throughout the program," she said. "General Ashford is having it reviewed." Something flickered across Halstead's face, fast, controlled, but not fast enough that Harlow missed it entirely. Fear dressed up in irritation. "Discrepancies happen," he said. "Data entry is not an exact science, Major. I'd be careful about the conclusions you're drawing from a few rounding differences. They weren't rounding differences, sir, and they all ran the same direction." "Is that so?" "Yes, sir." For a long moment, neither of them said anything, the silence stretching taut between them, and Harlow understood, watching the calculation happening behind his eyes, that he was trying to decide exactly how much she actually had. Whether this was a bluff he could talk his way past, or a wall he'd already run into without realizing how solid it was. "You should be careful, Major," he said, finally, his voice dropping into something quieter, something that sat right at the edge of a threat, without ever quite crossing into one a person could formally report. "Careers built on unconventional methodology are fragile things. It doesn't take much to remind a board that unconventional isn't the same as proven. I appreciate the concern, sir. Harlow kept her voice perfectly level. But I don't think my methodology is what's under review here. He held her gaze for one more long moment. Then he left without another word, and Harlow sat alone in her office afterward, feeling the specific, cold satisfaction of watching a man realize, in real time, that the thing he'd buried 5 years ago had finally worked its way back up to the surface. The remaining days blurred together, more cross-referencing, more careful documentation. A formal statement from the young corporal in records confirming the unusual routing of the expedited timeline request, all of it compiled into a case that grew heavier and more solid with each edition, until by the ninth day, when the board finally convened, Harlow felt something she hadn't expected to feel walking into that room. Not nervousness. Certainty. The boardroom was smaller than Harlow had imagined. Functional government issue. A long table at the front where 3 officers sat with folders open in front of them. Ashford presided from the center seat, his expression unreadable, formal in a way she hadn't seen from him before. To his left sat a personnel review officer Harlow didn't recognize. To his right, unmistakably, uncomfortably, sat Colonel Grayson Halstead, present in his official capacity as a senior training command observer, exactly as he'd promised he would be that morning in the classroom months earlier. Paisley sat at a smaller table facing the board, back straight, hands folded. No performance in her posture at all, just the quiet, focused stillness of someone who had spent 6 months learning exactly how much a moment like this actually cost. Harlow sat beside her, there in her capacity as the program's supervising instructor, packet in hand, waiting. Ashford opened the proceedings with the kind of brisk formality Harlow recognized from 100 other rooms, just like it: case number, officer, under review, purpose of the reassessment, and then, without any particular emphasis, in the same even tone he'd used for everything else, he added one more line. Before we proceed to the primary review, there is a matter of data integrity that requires the board's attention. Halstead's jaw tightened, just slightly, just enough that Harlow, watching closely, caught it. General, he said, I'm not sure a procedural side issue needs to delay. It's not a side issue, Colonel. Ashford's voice remained level, but something underneath it had hardened. It concerns the very data this board is meant to be reviewing. I'd like it addressed first. He nodded to Harlow. She stood, packet in hand, and walked the board through it, the same way she'd walked Ashford through it days earlier, slowly, methodically. Facts first, interpretation second. She laid out the 2 datasets side by side. The official package. Her own contemporaneous records. She showed the pattern, session by session, the gap widening as it approached the present. Exactly the sessions that mattered most to any board evaluating trend and improvement. She watched the 2 officers beside Ashford lean forward as the pattern became undeniable on the page in front of them. And the timeline for this board itself, Harlow continued, was accelerated by 3 weeks. Not through the standard review channel. Directly from Colonel Halstead's office, with no stated justification, at a point in the program's timeline calculated to minimize the window for anyone to catch the discrepancies before the review concluded. Silence settled over the room, heavy, complete. Halstead's face had gone rigid, the practiced smoothness that had carried him through 15 years of institutional maneuvering, finally cracking at the edges. This is a serious allegation, Major, he said, and his voice, for the first time since Harlow had known him, had lost some of its polish. Built on what? A whiteboard and a handwritten notebook. Built on cross-referenced, time-stamped records from 3 independent sources, Harlow said. My own official logs. My sister's personal notes, kept separately, without either of us coordinating them in advance, and the routing records from the records office confirming the unusual path this expedited timeline took to reach the board. Coincidence, Halstead said. Administrative error. You're building a conspiracy out of clerical noise. Then perhaps, Ashford said quietly, the Colonel wouldn't object to a formal audit trail review. If this truly is clerical noise, it will clear you entirely, Colonel. Quickly. I'd think that would be the outcome you'd want, if you have nothing to hide. The room went very still, because there was no answer to that question that didn't cost him something. Refuse, and it looked exactly like what it was. Agree, and the audit would find precisely what Harlow already knew it would find. Halstead said nothing for a long moment. I don't believe, he said finally, his voice carefully controlled, that a full audit is necessary. Perhaps there's room to acknowledge some irregularity in the data handling process. An oversight. Nothing more. An oversight, Ashford repeated, and something in his tone made it clear he wasn't buying the framing, not for a second. That consistently favored a lower score, session after session, for 6 months. And an unexplained timeline acceleration, routed through your office alone, timed precisely to shorten the window for anyone to catch it. He let that sit in the room for a long, uncomfortable beat. Colonel, I've known you a long time. I'd like to give you the benefit of the doubt here, genuinely. But you're going to have to give me something better than oversight. And that was when Harlow, watching Halstead's face carefully, saw something else surface behind his eyes, not defiance anymore, but the particular cornered look of a man doing rapid calculations about how much worse this could get if he kept pushing, versus how much smaller it might stay if he stopped. He chose smaller. There's a file, he said finally quietly, the words dragged out of him like something physically painful. 5 years old. A commendation recommendation for Major Sinclair. It never advanced through review. The room's attention shifted, sharp and immediate, toward Harlow. I'm aware of the file, Colonel, Harlow said evenly. I found it 3 weeks ago. Halstead's eyes flicked to her, something almost like resignation settling into his expression. I let it lapse, he said, deliberately. I won't pretend otherwise, not with the audit trail sitting in front of us. A pause. It was a different program then, a different set of priorities. I believed the recognition would have accelerated changes to the evaluation framework faster than the institution was ready to absorb them. That's not your call to make, Colonel, Ashford said, his voice cold now, unmistakably cold. That is precisely the kind of unilateral gatekeeping this institution cannot function with. You buried a commendation because you personally disagreed with the pace of change it might have caused. And when the same officer's methodology started producing measurable results in her sister's remediation, you altered data to slow it down again. Halstead didn't answer. I'll be recommending a full formal review of your conduct, Colonel, Ashford continued. Separate from this board, effective immediately, you're recused from any further involvement in Captain Sinclair's reassessment, and I'd strongly advise you retain counsel before your next conversation with the Inspector General's office. The words landed in the room with a finality that needed no further explanation. Harlow watched Halstead rise from his seat. Slowly, the composure he'd worn like armor for 15 years finally, visibly gone. He said nothing else. He simply gathered his folder and walked out of the room, and the door closing behind him carried a weight that Harlow felt settle somewhere deep in her chest, not triumph exactly. Something quieter. Something that felt, more than anything, like exhaling after holding a breath for 5 years without realizing it. Ashford turned back to the remaining matter at hand, his voice returning to its earlier, formal cadence, though something in the room had shifted permanently, the air lighter, cleaner, the way it feels after a storm finally breaks. Now, he said, let's review Captain Sinclair's actual progress, using the correct data. What followed took less than 20 minutes, because once the real numbers were on the table, 6 months of documented, verified improvement, culminating in a field exercise where Paisley had performed under genuine emergency conditions with the kind of composure that couldn't be faked or coached, there was very little left to debate. The board cleared the mentorship flag unanimously, formally noted the program's success, and recommended Paisley for her next assignment cycle without reservation. Paisley didn't cry until they were both outside the building, standing in the parking lot in the early afternoon sun. The kind of crying that comes fast and unguarded once the pressure holding it back finally releases. It's over, she said, half laughing, half sobbing, wiping at her face with the back of one hand. It's actually over. It's over, Harlow confirmed. You did that. Paisley looked at her, something fierce and grateful in her expression all at once. You found it. You built the whole case. You could have just let it happen to me, and instead you spent 9 days. You did half the work, Harlow said. The independent notes. That's what made it airtight. If it had just been my word against his, this goes very differently. Still, Paisley shook her head slowly. I don't know how to say thank you for something like this. It doesn't feel big enough as a sentence. You don't have to, Harlow said. Just, she hesitated, something in her chest tightening, unfamiliar and warm at the same time. Just don't forget what it took. Either of us didn't get here on our own. Not this time. Paisley nodded, and for a moment, standing in that parking lot with the sun on their faces, and 5 years of distance finally starting to close, neither of them said anything at all. They didn't need to. Word of what happened at the board traveled quietly through the base in the days that followed. The way these things always did, not officially, not in any announcement, but in the particular hum of a small, tight-knit community that noticed when a senior colonel disappeared from his post without explanation and put the pieces together well before anyone confirmed them out loud. Harlow didn't pay much attention to the rumors. She had other things on her mind, because 3 days after the board, her phone rang with a call she hadn't expected and hadn't fully prepared for. Her father's voice, careful, uncertain, on the other end of the line. Harlow. A pause. Can we talk in person? Just the two of us. They met at a diner off base, the kind of place with cracked vinyl booths and coffee that had been sitting on the burner too long, chosen deliberately, Harlow suspected, because it was neutral ground, not the family house, not a restaurant with any history attached, just a plain, unremarkable room where two people could say difficult things without the weight of memory pressing down on every word. Walter was already there when she arrived, sitting in a booth near the back, hands wrapped around a coffee mug he wasn't drinking from. Thanks for coming, he said, as she slid into the seat across from him. You said it was important. It is. He was quiet for a moment, turning the mug slowly on the table, and Harlow waited. Old habit, the patience of someone who had spent years learning that pushing a silence rarely made it end faster. I've been thinking a lot, he said finally. Since the party. Since everything after. Okay. I need to tell you something. About Ashford. He glanced up, meeting her eyes properly for the first time since she'd sat down. About why I invited him. Harlow felt something still in her chest. I wondered about that. We served together. Years ago. Before you were old enough to remember any of it clearly. Walter's voice had gone rougher than usual. The particular roughness of a man dredging up something he'd kept buried a long time. He was a captain then. I was a lieutenant commander. We worked the same joint command for 2 years, and he was one of the sharpest officers I ever served under. I respected him more than almost anyone in my career. I didn't know that. I never told you. Walter's jaw worked for a moment. I invited him to Paisley's party because I wanted an old friend there. That's all it was supposed to be. I had no idea. He stopped, shook his head slowly. I had no idea what would happen when he saw you standing in that room. Harlow didn't say anything. She let him keep going, sensing there was more underneath this, something he'd been building toward since, before she'd even walked through the diner door. There's something else, Walter said. Something he told me, a long time ago. Before you enlisted even. He looked down at his coffee, unable to hold her eyes for this part. You were maybe 16, home from some training camp you'd talked your way into that summer, one of those youth leadership programs the recruiters ran. Colm was visiting that week. He'd stopped by the house, an old habit from when we still lived close enough to see each other socially. And he watched you for maybe 20 minutes, watched you help your mother rearrange the garage without being asked, watched you read a map upside down at the kitchen table just to see if you could. Small things. Nothing dramatic. And before he left that night, he pulled me aside. Walter's voice had gone quiet now, almost a whisper. He said, Walter, your daughter has something in her I've only seen in a handful of people in 20 years of service. He said, whatever that is, don't let the house teach her to hide it. Harlow felt something crack open in her chest, slow and unbearable, the words landing with a weight that had nothing to do with volume, and everything to do with how long they'd been sitting unsaid. You never told me that, she said. No. Walter's eyes were wet now, and he made no effort to hide it. No effort to perform composure the way he usually did in front of her. I didn't understand what he meant. Not really. I thought he was talking about grit, discipline, things I already knew you had, things I was already proud of. He shook his head slowly. It took me 29 years and a ballroom full of strangers to understand he wasn't talking about grit at all. He was talking about exactly what you turned out to be. And I had the warning sitting in my hands the whole time. And I let myself teach you to hide it anyway. Harlow didn't say anything for a long moment. The diner hummed quietly around them. The clatter of dishes somewhere behind the counter. The low murmur of a television playing an afternoon game show nobody was watching. "Why didn't you ever ask?" she said finally. "If you had that memory sitting there, why didn't you ever wonder what he meant and ask me directly? Because asking would have meant admitting I didn't already know my own daughter." Walter's voice cracked on the word no. And I told myself, for years, that not knowing was the same as respecting your privacy, that you didn't need the fuss, the attention. You never asked for it, so I convinced myself you didn't want it. "I stopped asking," Harlow said quietly. "That's different from not wanting it. I know that now." He wiped at his eyes with the back of one hand, unashamed, and Harlow realized, watching him, that this was the first time in her adult life she'd seen her father cry in front of her, without trying to hide it. "I'm not asking you to forgive 29 years in one diner booth, Harlow. I know that's not how this works. I just needed you to know I had the truth in my hands a long time ago, and I let my own comfort matter more than your becoming exactly who you already were." Harlow sat with that for a long moment, feeling something in her chest that she couldn't fully name yet, not quite forgiveness, not quite anger, something suspended in the space between the two, waiting to see which direction it would finally settle. "I appreciate you telling me," she said finally. "That took something." "I know it did. It's not enough, no," Harlow agreed. "It's not. But it's a start. And a start is more than I've gotten in 29 years, so." She let out a breath, something in her shoulders loosening just slightly. "I'll take a start." They sat together a while longer, not saying much else, the silence between them different now than it had been. For most of Harlow's life, not the silence of avoidance, but something closer to two people, slowly learning how to occupy the same space, without one of them having to disappear to make room for the other. Diane called 2 days later. The conversation was shorter, more careful. Diane's voice carrying an anxiety Harlow recognized immediately, the particular strain of a woman who had spent 30 years avoiding difficult conversations and had no real practice navigating one, now that it had finally arrived at her door. "I owe you an apology," Diane said, without much preamble, the words sounding rehearsed in a way that made Harlow suspect she'd practiced them more than once before dialing. "A real one, not the kind I gave you at the party." "Okay. I let Paisley have the room. For years. Every time you had something to say, I found a way to steer things back toward her, and I told myself I was keeping the peace. Protecting the family from I don't even know what. Some kind of competition I imagined existed, that neither of you actually asked for." Diane's voice wavered. "I think I was scared, if I'm honest. Scared that if I gave you both equal attention, I'd somehow prove I loved one of you less. So instead, I just kept giving it all to the one who asked loudest, and told myself that was fair because you never seemed to need it." "I needed it," Harlow said quietly. "I just stopped asking. I know that now." A long pause. "I don't know how to fix 30 years, Harlow. I don't think there's a clean way to do that. But I'd like to try, if you're willing to let me." Harlow felt something soften in her chest. Not fully, not all at once, but enough to notice. "But it has to be different this time. Not fixed in one phone call. Built. Slowly. The way anything real gets built." "I can do that," Diane said. "I want to do that. It wasn't everything." Harlow understood that even as she hung up the phone, sitting alone in her apartment with the evening light slanting gold through the blinds. It wasn't a clean resolution, wasn't the kind of tidy ending where 29 years of quiet erosion simply dissolved because the right words finally got said out loud. But it was real, and real, she was learning, mattered more than tidy. 3 weeks later, Paisley's second promotion ceremony took place in a different venue than the first, smaller, quieter, No rented ballroom with a gold cursive banner. Just a modest hall on base with folding chairs, arranged in careful rows, and a simple podium at the front. The occasion was smaller too, in a sense. Not a captain's promotion this time, but an official assignment ceremony, marking the formal close of her remediation program and her clearance for the advanced deployment cycle she'd been working toward for 6 months. Harlow stood toward the back, the way she always did, old habit that hadn't fully left her, even after everything that had happened. But something about standing there felt different this time. Not like hiding, like choosing exactly where she wanted to be. Walter and Diane sat in the front row, and something in the way they sat had changed to less like an audience settling in for a performance, more like people who understood, finally, what they were actually there to witness. When it came time for Paisley to speak, she stepped up to the podium with none of the practiced showmanship Harlow remembered from the first party, months and a lifetime ago. She looked nervous, genuinely nervous, in a way that felt more honest than any confident performance she'd ever given. A few months ago, Paisley began, her voice steady despite the nerves underneath it. I stood in a room a lot like this one and told a group of strangers that nothing scared me. Not even a legend everyone whispered about in briefing rooms. A small, rueful smile. Turns out the legend was standing about 15 feet away from me that whole time, holding a glass of water, letting me make a fool of myself. Quiet laughter rippled through the room, warm laughter this time, not the careless kind from the first party, something gentler underneath it. I used to think being the best meant making sure everyone knew it, Paisley continued. Loud, immediate, impossible to miss. She paused, and her eyes found Harlow near the back of the room, holding there for a long moment. Then somebody taught me that the people who are actually good at what they do rarely need to announce it. They just show up, session after session, 6 in the morning, twice a week, for as long as it takes, and they don't walk away, even when you've spent years making them feel invisible. She didn't say the name Black Viper. Didn't need to. There was no dramatic reveal this time. No gasp rippling through the crowd. No evaluator stepping forward to unravel a secret nobody had been ready for. This wasn't that kind of moment, and Paisley understood, in a way she hadn't a few months earlier, that some things didn't need an audience to be true. My sister taught me that, she said simply. 2 words spoken plainly in front of the people who had spent years failing to notice what that relationship actually meant. My sister. Not a call sign. Not a legend. My sister. It landed somewhere deeper in Harlow than the reveal at that first party ever had. Because that night, months ago, she had been seen for what she'd done, a rank, a call sign, a resume of quiet accomplishment finally dragged into the light. This time, she was being seen for who she was. After the ceremony, guests mingled in small groups near a modest refreshment table, and Harlow found herself standing near the back windows, watching the late afternoon light stretch long shadows across the parking lot outside, when her father approached, hands in his pockets, something easier in his posture than she'd seen from him in years. I should have asked more, he said, without preamble, the same directness he'd used in the diner booth weeks earlier. About your life. Instead of assuming I already understood it. You said that already. At the diner. I know. He smiled, small and a little sad. I just wanted to say it again. Somewhere different. Somewhere that felt like it was actually moving forward instead of just apologizing for standing still. Harlow accepted that, and she understood, standing there in that quiet hall with her father beside her, that accepting it didn't mean pretending the last 29 years hadn't happened. Didn't mean erasing the missed ceremonies, the also in the army, the quiet accumulation of 1,000 small erosions that had shaped who she'd become in ways both good and difficult. Healing, she was learning, wasn't about deleting the record. It was about deciding what kind of relationship you were willing to build going forward, with your eyes open, without pretending the past hadn't shaped the present in ways that would take years, maybe the rest of her life, to fully untangle. She set some boundaries with her parents that evening. Gently but clearly, the kind of boundaries that come from finally believing you're allowed to have them. No more also in the army. No more automatic deference to whichever daughter was loudest in the room. Real questions, asked and actually waited for, instead of comfortable assumptions dressed up as respect for privacy. They accepted it better than she expected, she thought, watching her mother nod slowly, watching her father's shoulders settle into something like relief, that some part of them had been waiting a long time for her to ask for something. She just hadn't known that either, for most of her life. Later, after most of the guests had filtered out into the gathering dusk, Paisley found her by the door, car keys already in hand, the hall behind them quiet and mostly empty. "Can I ask you something?" Paisley said. "Sure." That night, at my first party, before General Ashford showed up and everything went sideways. She hesitated, a small, almost embarrassed smile tugging at her mouth. "What were you going to say? If none of that had happened? If I'd just kept talking about Black Viper all night and nobody ever found out?" Harlow thought about it for a moment, genuinely considering the question, instead of reaching for something easy. "Nothing," she said. Paisley blinked, surprised. Seriously, why not?" Harlow looked at her sister, really looked at her. The woman she'd become over the last several months. Someone who had finally learned to sit with being wrong instead of performing being right. Someone who had chosen, in a boardroom full of people who could have ended her career, to fight for the truth instead of the easy version. "Because if you have to tell people who you are," Harlow said, "eventually you're going to meet someone who already knows." Paisley was quiet for a second. Then she laughed, soft and real, and something in that laugh told Harlow they'd finally arrived somewhere neither of them had known how to find on their own. They walked out into the parking lot together, the evening air cool and clean, the last light fading gold behind the tree line at the edge of the base. Neither of them said much else. Neither of them needed to. Harlow used to think that first ballroom, all those months ago, had been the moment her family finally discovered who she was. She understood now that she'd been wrong about that. Discovering a rank, a call sign, a hidden resume of quiet accomplishment, that had only been the opening. The real discovery had taken months of hard, unglamorous work. Early mornings in a converted classroom. A live scenario in an open field where nobody had time to be wrong twice. A diner booth where a father finally said the thing he'd been carrying for 13 years. A phone call where a mother stopped performing peace long enough to actually build it. Her family hadn't needed to know who Black Viper was. They'd needed to learn how to see Harlow. And her sister had needed to learn something even harder than finishing top of a training course, how to become someone worth standing in front of other people, without needing the room to tell her so first. Paisley learned that, and somewhere in the 6 months it took to teach her, Harlow finally learned something too. That she never had to make herself smaller, just to help the people she loved feel bigger. That being seen when it finally happened didn't have to come from a scandal, or a salute, or a stranger's gasp across a crowded room. Sometimes it came quietly, in a diner booth, in a classroom before sunrise, in a sister's voice at a podium, saying 2 words that meant more than any call sign ever could. My sister. That was enough. It always should have been.